This video is for California employers only. And in this video, we're going to be discussing meal and rest periods and when you are required to give your employees, well, your non-exempt employees, rest periods and meal periods. So in the state of California, if you have hourly workers, if you have employees who are paid by the hour, you're required to provide them rest periods and meal periods throughout their work period. Now, if you have an employee that works between 3.5 and 4 hours per shift, you're required to give that individual one 10-minute paid rest period. Now, if that individual works an 8-hour shift, if we're talking about rest periods, you have to give that employee 2 paid 10-minute rest periods, one for every 4 hours in their shift. Now, if you have an employee that works 5 hours in one shift, that employer is required to provide that employee with a 30-minute unpaid lunch break. Now, let's repeat that again. If your employee is working 5 hours in one shift, you're required to give that employee a one unpaid 30-minute lunch break. Now, let's assume if your employee works 5 hours in one shift. So how many rest periods do you need to give that employee? One. You need to give that employee one 10-minute paid rest period because they're working 4 hours and a little bit more. And you're also required to provide that employee one 30-minute unpaid lunch break because they're working a 5-hour shift. Now, there is an exception. If they work 5 hours, sometimes they're able to waive, the employee is able to waive that 30-minute unpaid lunch break. But for the intents and purposes of this video, we're just going to be talking about generalities and rules. That employee who works a 5-hour shift is entitled to one 30-minute unpaid lunch break. Now, let's move on to 10-hour shifts. If an employee works a 10-hour shift, how many 10-minute paid rest periods are you required to give that employee? Now you have to count how many, majority hours of 4 are in that 10-hour shift. There's 2 4-hour segments and 1 2-hour segment. That employee who works 10 hours in one shift, they get one 10-minute paid rest period for that first 4 hours. Then they get another 10-minute paid rest period for that second 4 hours. And since they're only working 2 more hours, they're not entitled to another rest period, because if they're working 3.5 hours, yes. But since they're only working 2 hours, and 2 hours is only 50% of 4 hours, they're not working a majority of that 4-hour shift. So you don't need to provide them a third rest period. Now, if that employee's working 10 hours, though, you have to think about this. Now, how many groupings of 5-hour segments are there in that 10-hour shift? There are 2. So in that first 5-hour shift, that employee is entitled to one unpaid 30-minute lunch break. Now, since they're working another set of 5 hours, another 5 hours in that first shift, they are entitled to another 30-minute unpaid lunch break. Now, check this out. If an employee is working 10 hours, if they're working 10 hours in one shift, technically they're entitled to 2 10-minute paid rest periods and 2 unpaid 30-minute lunch breaks. Now, if they're only working 10 hours, there's an exception where that employee can waive taking that 30-minute unpaid lunch break. Now, if you're an employer, I wouldn't just let your employee say, I don't want to take my lunch break for the second half of the shift, because you need that documented. As an employer, you need to make sure that is documented that your employee is waiving their lunch period. Before we talk about the meal and rest periods, let's talk about the waiver agreement. Here we go. It's right here. At Juratovac Law, we're an employment law firm, so we provide a lot of documentation for employers, including meal and rest periods policies and including meal period waiver agreements. So let me print out our template meal period waiver agreement right now. You're gonna hear the printer start going off pretty soon, actually. Oh, there it goes. All right, here it comes. So for all the employers out here, what we have here is a meal period waiver agreement. This is something that you could provide to your employees if they want to waive their meal period. Now, what this says is meal period waiver for work day of 6 hours or less. 6 hours or less. So if one of your employees is working a shift that's 6 hours or less, that employee is able to waive that 30-minute unpaid meal period. But they need to sign a document stating that they're waiving that meal period. So this is what it says. I understand that under California law, I'm entitled to receive an unpaid and uninterrupted meal period of not less than 30 minutes during which I am relieved of all duties starting no later than the end of the 5th hour of work if I work more than 5 hours in a workday. I voluntarily agree to waive my 30-minute unpaid meal period on this date. You have to include what date you want to work on. My work and or scheduled shift will be completed in 6 hours or less in one workday. So it's essentially saying that your employee is voluntarily waiving their unpaid meal period because their shift is 6 hours or less in that particular workday. I understand that I understand that if my shift will exceed 6 hours, I am required to take an unpaid and uninterrupted meal period of at least 30 minutes. So this is actually a really good question that employers ask is, what happens if I want to provide my employee with a meal period longer than 30 minutes? And I always tell them that's fine. If you want to give your employee a 1 hour unpaid meal period, that's cool. But minimum, it has to be 30-minute minimum, unpaid, uninterrupted. So if you want to go above that minimum standard, go for it. Your employees will love it, depending on the situation. For this waiver to be valid, my supervisor must also agree to the waiver in writing by signing below, at which time this waiver immediately will become effective. So this meal period waiver agreement that I'm showing you needs to be signed on each day that an employee is waiving their meal period. Now, that's the first half of this agreement. The second half of this agreement is talking about the waiver of their second meal period in the day if they're working 10 or more hours. So this is what that says. I understand that under California law, I am entitled to receive an unpaid and interrupted meal period of not less than 30 minutes during which I am relieved of all duties starting no later than 1. The end of the 5th hour of work, my first meal period, if I worked more than 5 hours in a workday, and the end of the 10th hour of work, the second meal period, if I work more than 10 hours in a workday. I voluntarily agree to waive my second meal period on this date or these sets of dates when my total day's work and our scheduled shift will be completed in 12 hours or less in one workday, provided that I did not waive my first meal period. So if you have someone who's working 10 to 12 hours, they're able to waive their second meal period in a day if they sign this agreement, unless they already waive their first meal period. So if someone's working 10 to 12 hours, they need to take at least one meal period, and they cannot waive both. So this is an agreement I have for employers to provide to their employees if their employees want to waive either their first meal period if their scheduled shift is 6 hours or less, or their second meal period if their scheduled shift is 12 hours or less. So if you're an employer, you can find this document for sale in the link in my bio, where you can find all the template corporate agreements for California employers. Because before an employer can require their employees to waive their meal periods, you first need to have a meal and rest period policy. A meal and rest period policy is very important because oftentimes that management tells their employees when their employees are required to take meal periods and rest periods, but sometimes their employees forget to take them. Now, it's not because the employer is willfully restricting them from taking an unpaid rest period or an unpaid meal period. It's just because that employee might be working a little bit harder and they might forget to take it. Now, that is still no excuse for management if they see an employee not taking their rest periods or meal periods. If you're a manager or if you're an owner of a company, you should still tell that employee to take their meal periods and rest periods. Or else that can cause a lot of chaos later down the road, because 3 years later, that same employee is saying that instead of them willfully missing their own meal periods and rest periods, their employer restricted them from taking their meal periods and rest periods. And if that happens, there's a lot of hours of premium pay that the employer might be entitled to pay to that employee, which can be a really big headache for a small business 3 years down the road. So this is what the meal and rest periods policy that our firm provides looks like. Now, we talk about meal periods right here, and then we talk about rest periods. Now, it outlines each of the sections and each of the rules that these employees are required to take when working at your company, and the policy of when they're required to take their meal periods and rest periods. So there's no confusion. And one benefit of this agreement is after your employee receives this document, they have to sign and date the bottom of the document on the second page. That states that they received this, they read it, they understood it, and their employer's telling them exactly when they're supposed to take their meal periods and rest periods. So this way there's no confusion when the employee tries to say, hey, my manager never told me when I should have taken a meal period or rest period. And when you're the manager, you're the employer, you could say, yes, you can. On this date, we provided you this document, and you send a verification saying you understood the rules. So if you're a California employer and you have any questions about meal periods or rest periods or any of the policies that you should implement at your business, please feel free to reach out to us through the link in our bio. You can contact us by email, or you can schedule time for a consultation or straight on our website, www.jurotovaclaw.com. Our firm provides employment law audits for employers to make sure that you're California compliant and you have all of the policies and procedures in place so your employees also know that you're California compliant under the state's laws and regulations. If you have any questions, please feel free to list them in the comment section. Remember, none of this is legal advice, and I'm not your attorney because we don't have an attorney-client representation agreement yet. But if you're interested in working with us and our firm, please feel free to click that link in the bio and say hi.